Hey there, and welcome to GamEntropy, where we ask the question of what makes a game tick. So, today, we'll be discussing why a little tedium can be a good thing. Wait. Give me a chance here.
I'm not saying tedious and simplistic level design are inherently a good thing. They're not.
They're not. Please don't leave me.
However, said tedious or monotonous design can lead to positive results, if used correctly.
As we're going to discuss. So, today, we'll be using these games.
Final Fantasy X, Persona 3, portable version, Silent Hill 2, and Super Paper Mario.
As is customary, if spoilers offend you, head for the hills. And that's long enough.
So, we'll start with the fundamental question. How, or why, can tedium in design be a good thing? And why are we asking that question using Final Fantasy X? By all rights, FF10 has some of the worst dungeons in the history of the series. They're offensively bad because they're just bland, uninteresting roads. While this idea does pay off somewhat with the pilgrimage theme of the game's story, it's used to gross excess, as the game flip-flops between a series of traditional straight paths to a network of straight paths. And it's not until we finally return to the game's prologue, expressly set late in the story, and after a long and sometimes silly journey, that we're finally presented with this. The road to Zanarkand is the entry to the final area that precedes FF10's endgame, and it's the one part I would absolutely not change or remove in any way.
As always, the question is, why? What makes this area so special after all the swill we've been forced to drink thus far that is Final Fantasy X's dungeon design?
Because narratively, it works, and it works real well. Disregarding the poor dungeon design thus far, the road to Zanarkand is the end of a journey that's been built up throughout the entire game. The events building up in the story have set Zanarkand as the consistent destination for both the protagonist and his allies, and this road is the payoff to that journey. Let's face it, there's few things as offensive as building towards a goal, being prepared to receive some vital information or make a profound discovery, only to have an arbitrary barrier thrown in one's way for the sake of dragging the game out. Part of the reason this one section of Final Fantasy X works, really works, is because it's not a maze. It's a door to what the player has been spending the whole game working towards, and it allows safe passage, without the placement of any arbitrary obstacles or puzzles. I mean, hell, it even keeps the theme playing during the battles, just to make sure the sense of momentum isn't lost.
Farewell.
Now, this doesn't redeem Final Fantasy X from being offensively linear. Rather, it's a golden moment in a largely gold-plated game.
For a game that is somewhat tedious by design, but ultimately pays off the experience by doing so, look to Persona 3. This is Tartarus. It's a labyrinthine nightmare that springs up during the sinister dark hour in the middle of the night. Sometimes, this will be your nightlife. Other times, it feels like a job or a chore. Regardless of how you view it, ascending Tartarus is a necessary aspect of the Persona 3 experience, since many of the plot's mysteries revolve around it, and the climactic final events unavoidably take place at its peak. Of course, not long into the game you'll encounter one of these. You'll routinely stop every so often after reaching a certain point in the tower, which will open up when the next set of story events have been satisfied.
So, how tall is this place, exactly?
50 floors. No, 100 floors. Okay, how about 150? Wait, over 200?
How tall is this place?
Tartarus tops out just over 260 floors, after 9 months have passed in context of the story. While Persona 3 does do a good job keeping things fresh, in part by letting the player choose when to enter Tartarus, the necessity of having to do so makes the experience wear thin at times. Although, compared to Final Fantasy X, the sense of exploration in this game is far better. Because, well, it exists. There are only 6 types of terrain throughout the tower, meaning the player will have little sense of variety as they propel themselves up a linear building.
So, what would inspire someone to possibly do this to themselves? Over several dozen hours of gameplay and 9 months of game time.
This is the payoff. Superficially, it may not seem like much, but this is the beginning of where it becomes entirely worthwhile. At this point in the game, it has been made abundantly clear to the player that this area represents the last sector of Tartarus, and the game does not betray that impression. Up to this point, the characters in the story have been wrestling with their mortality following the revelation of a very imminent death they all face. Entry in this area itself symbolizes the collective resolve of the characters to fight for their lives, and even after slogging through over 200 floors prior, makes this last crawl become much, much easier. Persona 3, in all its incarnations, is a pretty stretched example. The quality of the experience does take a lot of the edge off, but even when one decides to just try and beeline their way to the next juncture, the amount of running and exploration involved can become wearing.
Still, Persona 3 and Final Fantasy X are games that satisfy the player near the end of the journey. Both are titles which use simplified design to resolve their events in some way. Tedium doesn't always have to pay off the final experience. It can also be used to set the stage.
This is the beginning of Silent Hill 2. After a brief opening sequence, James Sunderland is sent running down a path. And more path. And more path. And even more path. Virtually nothing happens along this run, save for a few creepy background sounds, and an encounter with a character that will show up later in the story. In fact, this whole segment can be completed in less than 5 minutes of playtime, though it's liable to feel longer the first time through. By all rights, for a horror game, this is incredibly dull, and only saved a little by the varied terrain. For Silent Hill 2, however, it also serves as a phenomenal way to set up the story. Rather than assault the player's senses with some horrific incident, the game works to make the player feel cut off. The basic idea is, in some ways, reminiscent of Resident Evil 2, released 3 years prior to Silent Hill 2, where the player is effectively driven to the isolation of the precinct, cut off from the real dangers outside. This isolation is imposed by the zombies placed to overwhelm the player, whereas Silent Hill 2 creates a self-imposed isolation. The long and uneventful run at the beginning of the game was placed deliberately by the designers to produce an intended sensation.
まず最初のその展望台から森までは一度その街に着いたら引き返せないような距離を出すことによってその孤独感とか不安感とかその隔離された街に来てしまったっていう感じとかっていうのを出したかったんで。
Not wanting or being unable to go back is a philosophy employed repeatedly throughout the game. James, and by extension the player, is routinely placed in positions where advancement can only be attained by further stranding oneself. These events are not exciting, they're uneventful and repetitive. Running down a straight stairway has got to be about the most boring thing one can do. The excitement comes from the claustrophobia and the fear of isolation, which is hammered in by the straightforwardness of the descent. A maze could risk distracting the player, creating a sense of safety through a challenge to overcome. The straight and narrow descent functions then in keeping the player acutely aware of where they're placing themselves, so that when they do reach the maze, it's already too late to go back.
While most of Silent Hill 2's long and linear paths are used to encourage a sense of isolation, The game puts a different spin on this mechanic at the end of the game.
Mary?
What do you want, James?
The last hallway in Silent Hill 2, before the final boss and the ending play, is a straight path with a visible exit. An extended bit of dialogue plays during the sequence, and the hall itself is intentionally structured so that the player is guaranteed to hear most of it, but has the choice as to whether to hear all of it. This use of a straight, one-way hall with no twists, turns, or stops is extremely effective. The player is ensured that they can see the exit, and their decision to move on or listen to all Mary has to say can have a direct impact on the scene they encounter in the very next room. Rather than utilize the sense of isolation other long and featureless passages had up until this point, the hallway here allows the player the capacity for choice, and promises that they will not be stopped or misled because of a stubborn puzzle or a sharp corner coupled with a strange camera angle.
James! Wait!
So, with all this to consider, we have pretty ample evidence that linear and even tedious design can be used effectively, enforcing sensations of accomplishment, accommodating renewed determination, and even affecting self-imposed isolation in a way that more dynamic sequences and areas might not convey in the same manner.
It's always the innocent-looking ones. Super Paper Mario's 6th world entrenches the player in roughly a couple dozen rounds of gratuitous arena fights. Too easy to be considered a challenge, but too tedious to quickly breeze through. This tedium was used to precipitate the destruction of this particular world, dropping the player into, well, this. And then, the walking begins. So, I'm not sure where they're going with this. I suppose the desolation is meant to highlight the tragedy of this world's destruction, and while it's unfortunate, I didn't really have any attachment to it. Still walking. The trouble is, there's no real sense of loss here. Running me through bout after bout in an arena didn't exactly give me affection for the place before it was wiped out. Still walking. Maybe it's a metaphor for man's struggle against paper or something. Okay, so the first problem here is that it's hard to tell if the developers were trying to be artsy or just got lazy or at least unimaginative. A brief look at Metal Gear Solid 3, a game similar in that it's largely dynamic save for one lazy area, compensates for the simplicity of the sequence by reprising a softer, more dissonant take on the Snake Eater theme.
But you're so supreme. I give my life, not for honor, but for you.
As much as this sequence drags to simply play, one can tell it's placed to make the player feel something, and serves as a clear divider from where the player is and where they're going. And sound is an important component to bring levity to these protracted sequences, be it with music that becomes more vibrant and less ominous, picking up in tempo and complexity, or a soundtrack that swells with hope and optimism before both a destination reached and a world lost. Or even a subtle sense of foreboding, with the strange noises serving to place the player in a state of unease. Super Paper Mario may be undercut by its own style, trying to convey destruction, but doing so in a way that's more cute than it is scary. The silence in this space is too vacant to create an impression, and it's too cute to be imposing.
Okay, so to begin closing this matter up, why pause at this discussion in the first place? The point is that things don't need to be all action all the time. Games are a medium that can afford to let us take some time and savor accomplishment, or invest a little while into preparing us for the experience to come. There is, however, still an art to using linearity and drawn-out sequences where little to nothing happens, and it's not just a technique that should be used to do the bare minimum of work. Final Fantasy X? Go. Go now and never return. Go on. Get.